Welcome to the EcoThink podcast, where you join us on a dive into climate change and social justice issues through a STEAM lens. Each episode, we will break down silos, build up amazement, and bring on action. We invite you to follow us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions. If you'd like to join the Eco Geeks in supporting this podcast for just a couple of dollars a month, you can do that on Patreon at www.patreon.com/EcoThink. Now let's get on to the show. Hey, Yuko, how's it going?
Slowly rotting away in the house because I'm an extrovert stuck in lockdown mode.
Yeah, how are you guys handling it?
Luckily, I do live in the same space as my family, so it's nice until it gets a little too crowded at home.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
I'm feeling a little bit zoomed out, but I'm sure a lot of people are as well.
I think everyone can definitely feel that. I mean, we are speaking to people in the future, so who knows what it'll be like in 3 months' time. Maybe people will be socializing again with the upcoming vaccine. Who knows?
Oh, I saw news for that and I was so excited. I'm like, yeah. It's starting to look up.
It is.
Starting to look up.
It is for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I mean, COVID aside, it is nice to see your lovely face.
And the same goes for you. Yeah. I miss seeing you in person.
Yeah, I miss seeing you too. Yeah.
It's funny. I was looking up things people should do during the pandemic, and a lot of people were saying, if you enjoy writing in your journals or like doing little vlogs and just kind of recording how your daily life has changed during the pandemic, it really informs future generations. Our words can end up in a history textbook.
Isn't that funny to think about how there are actually journals today that are from a couple hundred years ago that are surviving and tell us a lot about the lives of people back then. Yeah. And the same could be said for now, even more so because it's not even necessarily on paper. Now it's digital usually. Yeah. So, yeah.
I think I just thought that was definitely very romanticized, but I also thought that was very uplifting and like, oh, that's a really nice thought.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure. It puts things into perspective. You know, what we're currently living today will one day be history.
Yeah. And speaking of history,
nice segue.
Just keep practicing those segues, right?
Oh, yeah. I don't know that we'll ever get them down, Yuko. Quite frankly, I think people will be listening to this podcast into the future and will go, yet another terrible segue by Yuko and Maia.
Well, anyways, speaking of plastic, I did like not too deep of a dive, not as deep as the Marianas Trench, but, down to the twilight zone of the ocean. Did a bit of a dive into plastics and the history of plastic and recycling and, from our last episode. And I just found so much propaganda.
Propaganda?
I don't know. I really don't know how else to word it. So let's kind of begin with the recycling that we're familiar with. From every city that I lived in, at least in Canada, we've had the blue bin program. So this means you get a blue bag or a hard plastic blue bin, and you get to throw your paper, cardboard, plastics, hard plastics, and tins and metals and glass. Well. Yeah. So those are all items that are accepted in our blue bins that the city takes to take to their sorting facility, and we kind of just forget about it. But I kind of looked into the other items that are technically recyclable but are not accepted in the blue bins, and I was kind of doing a bit of a dive into why are they not accepted? Why can't we recycle these as easily as paper and cardboard and hard plastics? And it just opened a huge can of worms.
I bet. There's so many different types of things that if you look at the list of what's accepted on a blue bin, it's not as long as you think.
No, it's
Mm-hmm.
so short. And you're also, the city asks you very nicely to make sure you rinse out all of your containers, because food contaminants can cause like a whole batch of recyclables to get thrown into the trash, because the sorting facilities can't deal with those kind of contaminants.
Yeah.
So that was just like, whoa, this is insane how much of our recyclables actually get trashed. So actually, let's start at what is recycling.
Okay.
So what's recycling? Recycling is basically the process of turning waste materials into building blocks for new materials.
Mm-hmm. So it's like they melt it down into like its base components, melt or mulch or whatever, depending on the product, right? And then I guess presumably it can be reshaped into something that's usable again, or at least that's the idea.
Presumably. For example, organics is a type of recycling.
Yeah.
You recycle the nutrients in your food waste.
Interesting. Yeah. It's just, we call it composting. It's just two different words for essentially a similar process. So why do we use recycling for what we think of as recycling? Like, I don't know.
So that is where the history of recycling comes from.
Ooh.
And this kind of goes back to World War II. Let's start from World War II.
World War II, it goes back that far.
Yes.
That's like, what is that? That's like 60, 80 years? That's 1940s. How many years
1940s.
Ago? Wow. That's 80 years ago.
Yep. So this... Wow. But if you think about the grand scheme of things, plastics haven't been around for a very long time. 80 years is not a long time.
Yeah, I guess I was just thinking that we would be recycling other things before plastics as well. But does recycling, the way we think of it, coincide with the creation of plastics?
No, people have been recycling for millennia.
I'm just thinking of the way that we think of it now.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. Yeah, like composting or reusing, for sure. Yeah.
But the modern way of recycling, or what we now consider recycling, the first thing we think about when we say recycling is our blue bins. So that came actually from the plastics industry. The plastics industry created recycling the way that we know it today.
Okay, I think you're going to have to go back to World War II because you're blowing my mind.
I know, I blew my own mind. I was like, what the heck? Everything I knew is a lie. So the reason why I wanted to date back to World War II was when that was kind of the era where plastics really started to integrate with society. Now, to be fair, most of the research I found are United States based or United States focused. So when I say World War II, I come from the perspective of US and also North America.
Okay.
I'm coming from that perspective. I just want to lay that out there. So plastics during World War II was actually very, very useful. So nylon was invented around that time, and nylon was used to line the inside of the helmets for soldiers. It was used for cables for the radios. It was used for so many different things. And after the war was over, there was a very hard push by the plastics industry to get consumers to start using plastic in everyday items like buckets and containers and all sorts of stuff. And
makes sense because they want to make money from it, right?
Exactly. And since the war is over, they don't have war money anymore. And plastics during that era, plastics were made with fossil fuels and oils. So this is all synthetic plastic. It's all human made. It's all a chemical process. And if people start reusing their plastic items, the companies don't make any more money.
That's fair, right? Like if you think about it, if you
Mm-hmm.
have one plastic water bottle, like one of those sports water bottles that are made out of plastic that people see all the time, that like you squeeze it and it squirts water out, like they're perfect.
Mm-hmm.
So many gym rats have them, right? And
Exactly.
they last for a really long time.
They do. They
Yeah.
really do. But yeah, they're great because they last a long time. They're durable and they're flexible as well, so you can mold them into any shape. But if people keep reusing the one item that they have, the plastics company don't make any money. So the plastics company, along with their fossil fuel partners, started pushing out advertisements and marketing to get people to use more plastic. I
And
think one of the
single
ads,
use plastics
single
too.
use plastic, yes.
Yeah.
I think one of the ads I saw, it was the definition of a vintage ad.
I love
Was,
those.
I know, I do
They're
too.
so great.
The aesthetic is great, but the messaging was awful. I'm paraphrasing, but I remember the caption saying, "We live in a disposable society, so why do you keep reusing this one item? Buy a new one."
That's hilarious because if you think about it, we're literally flipping the narrative right now
Yeah.
in 2021.
Yeah.
Like,
So imagine being a little girl growing up with those ads in your face and seeing like, oh, don't save, just use a new one.
yeah.
Crazy, right?
Well, that's crazy. And if you think about it, it's alluring in a way because who really wants to do dishes? Like,
Yeah.
they're my least favorite chore in the world. And if I was living at that time, I was like, yeah, I want to, pack up a little lunchbox, or I want to go on a picnic or something with my loved ones. I don't really want to have to do the dishes after that. Like, it would be so nice to just be carefree and throw it out at the end of the day. And that's exactly what they capitalized on
They
with those
totally did.
advertisements.
There was even an ad that I saw where it was this lovely young couple having a picnic in this lush green lawn. And when they were done their meal and they were packing up, they just took the picnic blanket and just waved it to get all the plastic containers off of it, packed everything up and left, and just like garbage strewn everywhere.
What? That's ridiculous.
So
We'll have to put these advertisements in the show notes if you can get them.
yeah,
Because, like, I can hardly believe it. And I know that it's real, but yeah.
I have so many links I will send you after we're done our chat, because there's another ridiculous marketing campaign that I saw out of the plastics industry. But I digress. Back to the topic on hand. So around this time where plastics became a staple thing in almost every American household, and people started to realize, oh crap, the environment and pollution, we're not thinking about it. So the first Earth Day, if I remember correctly, was in 1970. Sometime in the 1970s was when the first Earth Day came about. And that first Earth Day had such a huge political impact.
I bet.
Like huge political impact, that the plastics lobby group actually bought advertisements called "Keep America Beautiful." All right, and
so the plastic company,
yes,
is saying, okay,
the
but
plastics industry, yeah.
And so, is this leading into the idea that the plastic companies are the ones that promoted the idea of recycling the way we know it today?
It's leading up to that, but this is even more ridiculous.
Where this is going.
This is more ridiculous. So the plastics industry and their lobby groups, they bought a bunch of advertisements because they have the money, because they're backed by fossil fuels, to create these Keep America Beautiful advertisements, showcasing like the amount of pollutions in parks, on the beach. And oh my God, you're either gonna laugh so hard at this or get so angry, but they hired an Italian man to play a Native American man in a canoe with full on like Native American regalia. And this man canoes onto this beach, and he starts pulling his canoe on the beach, and there's just plastic pollution, like garbage everywhere on the sand, on this beautiful picturesque area. And the camera zooms in on this Italian actor's face, and there's a tear, one single tear coming out from the corner of his eye.
Okay. Oh my God. There is so much to unpack there. There's so much to unpack there. Not least of which the issue that we're all thinking of, the like paying an Italian actor to play a Native American person in an advertisement. That's just ridiculous. And I know we're not perfect these days, but thank God we're improved from then, because Jesus, that's terrible. Second, that the way you describe that sounds like the plastic companies kind of directing the blame at the person using the plastic.
Ding, ding, ding. That was the
that
whole
pisses
point.
me off. It's like, it's your fault that you're littering. It's not our fault that we're forcing you to use plastic because it's the only thing available.
Instead of, having the company shifting focus from making disposable plastic, they put the blame on the consumers by saying, don't litter your plastic, think about the environment, and
recycle instead.
We're not there yet.
Oh, no, it's still not there. Oh,
this is before the recycle. It's around the same time, but this is slightly before. But this campaign is called Keep America Beautiful. If you YouTube it, you'll find that exact advertisement on YouTube.
Sometimes I love how permanent the internet is, because there's so much money that goes into trying to make people forget the shit that companies do. And sometimes it can, like, I agree that there are moments where it's like, okay, we need to just let this rest. But this is a situation where it's like, okay, we know that you did this, and are still doing it. So you're not going to pull the wool over our eyes. Like, we have records of this.
No, the first time I saw that commercial, I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I had this is so ridiculous. And it was one of those public service announcements, and they had the caption, advertisement for the betterment of the public. It's like our don't you put it in your mouth.
Oh, yeah. Put it in your mouth. Or like the house hippo thing.
Yeah.
Where it's like those... learn to recognize that not everything on the TV is real or something. Yeah. Wow. Okay, so they have this massive advertisement. What happens next?
So they started putting responsibility of plastic pollution on the consumers rather than from the producers.
Rather than taking responsibility. Yeah.
Exactly. And because of this huge environmental push, because this is also around the same time as Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring book was published.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's a huge, this was a huge environmental movement.
Yeah.
So the plastics industry came out with this idea of recycling. So they'll collect these plastics and they'll turn it into something better.
They'll turn it into new plastics, quote unquote.
Exactly. But
I knew there was a but.
But there's always a but. So the Society of the Plastic Industry, which is still a thing today, they have a very polished looking website.
I bet they do.
Yeah. In the 1980s, they started to recycle, and they did really want to do this. They did really want this to succeed. But what they found was the act of recycling, the infrastructure for recycling, and the process for recycling was way too expensive than compared to just keeping the status quo of producing plastic.
So using brand spanking new plastic is less expensive. It's cheaper for a company to do that than it is to go get otherwise garbage plastic, like stuff that's already been used, melt it down and reuse that.
Exactly.
Whoa.
So
and so that means that they're not going to use it because they're a company and they want the best profits.
yeah. And I actually have a quote here that I'm going to read out. So this is a quote from Larry Thomas. He is the Society of Plastics Industry president in 1974. If the public thinks that recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment.
Wow. I'm kind of speechless at that, actually, because, I mean, like, let that sink in for a second.
One more time for those in the back. If the public thinks that recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment. Larry Thomas, president of the Society of Plastics Industry, 1974.
That is so true. That is so true. Can you remember back to middle school time? Maybe it was elementary school. Anyone listening, can you remember when you went into school and you first recognized the quote unquote importance of recycling? Either you walked into school and there was already a lot of bins set up. Maybe you're one of our younger listeners and you've always kind of grown up with tons of separation bins and it's just been normal. I remember walking in and there was only, like one blue bin for plastic stuff, and they would kind of separate it out after the fact if they had a blue bin at all. And I remember being so adamant that we had to recycle everything as a kid. And that was like the one thing you focus on. Because it's a personal action that's controllable, or at least you think it is.
We'll get there.
Oh, man.
I'm sorry. This is a huge topic.
No, that's fair. So can I ask, though, before we move on,
mm-hmm.
and this might be jumping down the timeline a little bit, and
that's
so
okay.
that's totally fine. But so when I think of recycling, I think of a pretty simplified process because I don't really know the ins and outs. I think of like, okay, they collect it. They probably have to sort it a bit more. They probably have to clean it if they do that. And then they probably would have to throw it in a big melting pot and then would extrude it or put it in some shape or something like that. That's kind of the process that I think of. Is that kind of process that you're talking about here when it comes to like, okay, that entire process is more expensive and more resource intensive than just making plastic straight from fossil fuel? Is that the kind of process? Is there more to it?
There's more to it. And
okay.
I think to really answer that question or get more understanding, we have to understand the context of what kind of plastics are there.
Okay.
There are 6 different types of plastic, and sometimes there's a 7th one for all of the others. So,
okay. Yeah. An occasional 7th.
An occasional 7th. So let me talk about the different types of plastic and the differences, and then we'll talk about how we recycle them.
Sure.
So the 2 most common blue bin recyclables is resin number 1 and 2. So resin number 1 is PET, polyethylene terephthalate. So these are like our plastic drink bottles.
Oh yeah, I mean we call them plastic. Like pet bottles,
Yeah, pet bottles.
Yeah.
And then the resin number 2 is PHD, high density polyethylene, and these are like the hard plastic that when you bend it, you can see discoloration. So like laundry detergent bottles.
Okay.
And shampoo bottles. Those are the second type of plastics.
Thick ones.
Exactly. So these 2 types of plastic can be basically grinded down or melted down to be reused again.
Okay.
Really easily.
But do they get reused in the same form or do they degrade?
They get reused in a different form. So what most recycling plants do is after they break everything down, they actually put it in like a big bale and they sell it off to other companies to be used.
Okay. So it's not necessarily going to become another laundry detergent bottle.
No. So
in fact, it might not even be able to. Like it gets turned into something else.
It does. It could be part of your clothing. It could be another drink bottle, or it could be packaging, stuff like that.
Okay.
Maybe not packaging. Packaging is a whole different beast to tackle.
Yeah.
And then you have resin 3, 4, 5, 6, which our blue bins don't accept. And these are things like cling wrap, soft plastic bags. These are, let's see, my list here. Milk cartons, because milk cartons they're not completely paper. They have some plastic components to it. Yogurt containers, deli food containers, styrofoam is a big one. The reason why most recycling plants, at least for the city ones, don't accept these is because they might contain hazardous materials. They might contain toxins. They might, when melted down, they might release a toxic gas. I'm thinking of a specific one. I'm looking at my notes right now and I can't remember. Number 3, PVC, polyethylene chloride. When you melt this type of plastic down, you get, what do you get? You get hydrochloric acid. So
that's pretty damaging.
Yeah. And if you recycle all of these plastics together, then PET plastic might get contaminated and they're no longer sellable or usable again.
Oh, okay. So basically all of these different plastics, because there's all of these different plastics and because, and I'm sure we'll get to it, but people aren't, including myself, aren't really that great at separating out their plastics, and would really love to hope that all of their plastic is actually getting recycled when it's not. Partly because of that, but also because we just don't have the proper facilities for it or the proper demand for it. The drive to actually recycle these plastics at a good rate for cheap is just not going to happen.
No. And it's a very expensive process because you do need a different way to recycle these different types of materials. For example, let's take styrofoam. Styrofoam is very porous. It's mostly air, so they get contaminated pretty easily and they're difficult to clean. And just collecting them, they're huge pieces. They take up a lot of room, but there's not a lot of substance to them. So it is quite expensive to break them down. And you need to add a different chemical as an additive to styrofoam to make them reusable again, is how I understood it when I was looking up how to recycle styrofoam.
Interesting.
Yeah. But do you recall seeing those tiny little numbers on the bottom of your plastic containers? And it's surrounded by a symbol that looks like the recycling symbol, right?
Yeah, it looks like a little triangle.
Yeah. That is not a recycling symbol. If it has a number in the middle of it, it's a resin identification code, and that tells you what kind of plastic that is. But the reason why we have these symbols today, at least on some of the plastics, especially those that's coming out of the States, is because the plastics company, during the same time as the environmental movement, they lobbied to different state governments that any plastic coming out of that state has to have that symbol on it with the number because it looks like the recycling symbol.
Doesn't that kind of confuse things though? Like
that's the point.
I mean, that's probably their point, right?
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, and the recycling symbol is public domain.
Oh, interesting. So anybody could use it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so obviously what we have so far is we have the history of recycling, which is turning out to sound like the history of a very smart company taking advantage of miscommunication, misinformation, and a desire on the individual's part to do good. Would that sum it up pretty much?
In a nutshell, that is.
Okay. So where do we go from there then? Like, how is there more to the story?
There is more to the story. I don't want to leave everyone on like a sour note. So I actually want to talk a little bit about the process of recycling in most cities. This is how I think Victoria does it too. So once our blue bin is picked up, where do they go? They don't just go off to Neverland. They don't get flown away by Peter Pan.
There's no recycling fairies? What?
Wouldn't that be amazing? But we don't live in a fantasy world, unfortunately.
Just leave a plastic water bottle under your pillow, wake up, it's 50 cents.
That would be sick. So the recycling truck, they bring all of our collected recycling to a materials recovery facility.
Okay.
And in this, it's basically a recycling plant. So these items are stuck on a conveyor belt, and it's sorted by machine, but also by hands, by humans.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's people standing next to the conveyor belt sorting it out.
Mm-hmm. And there's multiple conveyor belts that these materials go through. Most plants that I saw sorted out cardboard first. So they have different components of the machine that sorts everything by weight. Mm-hmm. And then they sort out metals with a magnet. And then they sort out glass, and then they grind up the glass into fine pieces to be reused again. So it's a huge, huge, huge process. And which is why it's so expensive.
Yeah. Well, it requires a lot of machinery and a lot of people.
Yeah. So that's our city recycling. They take the most, they take like our plastic bottles and paper and all of that. But now we're seeing more and more, I wouldn't call them private recyclers, but we are seeing more and more social enterprises accepting recyclables that are not commonly taken by your blue bin and using those recyclables for raw materials.
Interesting.
I want to bring up, let's see, TerraCycle. I was looking up Canadian specific recycling initiatives, and TerraCycle is at least has a Canadian component in it, and they divert waste from landfills to be recycled. So anything that we can't throw in a blue bin, instead of just sending it to the landfill, they try to intercept it at the consumer level. So they partner with a lot of different brands. I actually went on their website, and let's take Brita for example. They actually partner with Brita to establish different drop-off zones around the different cities. And in Victoria specifically, you can go to, I think it was London Drugs. You can go to a London Drugs and drop off your Brita filters, and they will mail those Brita filters to TerraCycle to be properly dismantled and disposed of.
Oh, interesting.
Because you can't throw Brita filters into our blue bins.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they offer free recycling programs where they give you shipping labels so you can ship them your recyclables.
That's cool.
And they pay for it all.
Yeah. So they have it in Canada. Do they also have it in the US?
I didn't look into the US. I was more focused on what Canadian initiatives.
Oh yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. Well, that's kind of cool. I think I have heard of them before. I remember I forget who it was, but I remember hearing about them with regards to like snack wrappers and stuff like that. Like if you were to have a granola bar or a chip bag or something, like they might be able to recycle it. It's kind of neat.
They also recycle cigarettes.
Whoa, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. And so I was like, oh my God, cigarettes, they're recyclable? Like, how do you recycle cigarettes? So I clicked into it, and they also had this lovely footnote on that page that said, hey, if you're struggling with addiction, here are some resources.
Oh, very cool. So it sounds like they're actually thinking about, the process of it.
Yeah, so that's TerraCycle is their name again. I guess we can link them in the show notes.
Yeah, that'd be great. And if you're interested in learning more about them, feel free to look in the show notes, and we'll link TerraCycle there.
And there's two other companies I want to bring up because I thought they were really cool. It's Full Circle Plastics in Lethbridge, Alberta, and they specifically use plastic paint containers to create plastic lumber. So building, like actually construction material.
I've heard about something similar to that. Not this Lethbridge place. What's it called?
Mm-hmm.
Full Circle.
Full Circle Plastics.
That's cool. I've heard about something similar to that. I think there was a place on Vancouver Island up until a few years ago. Unfortunately, they had to shut down. But yeah, the idea of like compressing it into almost, it looks like wood, but it's not.
Yeah. And the thing with the paint containers is it's paint, so it's toxic. So not a lot of recycling plants can take them because it'll, by breaking down that container in their plant, they can contaminate other materials.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also Fusion Thetics, Ontario-based company that uses Keurig coffee pods, Nespresso aluminum, and cannabis containers, along with agricultural bale wraps and greenhouse film for their plastic lumber.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah, I like was looking at what exactly made their lumber so interesting. They only use one type of polymer. And if everyone recalls from when I talked about plastics in the last episode, plastic is made from polymers, which are just long chains of repeating molecules. So they only use polyethylene PE plastics for all of the materials, which I thought was really cool because most plastic that we know of and that we use are complex plastics. They are mixed plastics.
Mm-hmm.
So they are like type resin 1 or 2 mix or something like that.
Interesting.
Which makes it harder to recycle.
Yeah, of course. And so I guess during the process of making the plastic lumber, they must have to specifically take out those polymers.
I don't know if they specifically take out those polymers or they choose what plastic they use as their raw materials.
It would be interesting to talk to somebody from one of those companies. If anyone listening to this podcast knows someone from TerraCycle or Full Circle Plastics or
Fusion Thetics,
reach out to us. We'd love to talk to someone.
Yeah,
just to learn more about what you do. It's awesome.
It's just so cool. Like it's so uplifting to see because it's yeah. And like I said last episode, plastics aren't necessarily the problem. It's how we manage it. Like it's just a mismanagement of our waste, which has been going on for years.
Well, it's a mismanagement of waste, but I think in that sentence we have to be specific as well. It's a mismanagement from the top down, from the company providing it. There's no thought through to the end stage of that product. So it's not necessarily the mismanagement of our consumer waste, although yes, that is true, but that is a result of the fact that the management of that waste wasn't thought of to begin with, and it was in fact sabotaged. Yes. So, it's something to consider when I think what I find really helpful on those really dark days sometimes that, you just kind of get into that mindset of like, I'm doing everything I can, like, and the world's still just going to shit. there are days where you have to think about that sometimes. And what helps me then is acknowledging that my actions, although important, and I don't think anyone can deny that, there is something to be said for putting it into the larger context. And everyone listening to this podcast, everyone who cares about the environment, I want you to think about it for a moment that your actions are important, but they alone will not fix everything. And it is okay to not be the best recycler in the world. Like, talking specifically about recycling for a moment, it is okay to have forgotten to clean out a bottle. It is okay to not be perfect when it comes to sorting things out. Do your best when you can, of course, but also recognize that we all kind of have to come together, and also the companies and the corporations that are responsible for the creation of these products in the first place, that I think is where we need to focus a lot of more of our attention, rather than focusing our guilt and our attention on ourselves and on how we feel. I think we need to try and direct a lot of that energy towards those corporations.
Really well said. I agree with all of the above, Maya. And it's really difficult because I sometimes get into my head like, I'm just this tiny little bean in this world, and these corporations are multi-million-dollar companies, and we do live in a society that is run by money.
Yeah.
Like, that's the reality of it. What can I do? Well,
well, do we have some actions for you?
yes. One of the main things I want to stress on a personal level is reduce your consumption.
Yeah.
Reduce your consumption. It is perfectly okay to go thrift shopping. All right. Vintage style is coming back. Live up your 70s dreams, man.
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah. And commit to your one tote bag. Just commit to your one tote bag. You don't need 50 tote bags. I mean, I am 100 guilty of this, but commit to your one tote bag.
Use what you have, you know. I think as much as I am a sucker for beautiful, sustainable living products, they're not needed. And to anyone listening who is part of a sustainable living product business, I love you. You do amazing work. But we also have to admit that a lot of people listening to this podcast, not everybody to be fair, but a lot of people listening to this podcast probably have everything they need in their house to be able to live without single-use plastics, or at least reduce that drastically. If you have a cloth bag in your house already, you don't need to go out and buy another beautiful tote bag. If you have plastic Tupperware, yeah, okay, don't come at me about microwaving it. Just don't microwave it. Put it on dump it out onto a plate or into a bowl before you microwave your lunch. But you don't need to go and buy gorgeous glass sustainable ware. And in fact, most people don't do that. Like, let's learn from people who are way more thrifty, way more aware of this stuff, who might have to do it by necessity, but those people have a lot of wisdom when it comes to this kind of stuff. And I think we get tied up in the consumerism of sustainable living, and it's just yet another trap. Try not to fall for it.
My first generation Asian Canadian friends might get this, but we wash our Ziploc bags.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah,
we wash Ziploc bags.
We do too. I remember actually first seeing that at my aunt and uncle's house in Nanaimo, and like I hadn't seen it before then. And then once I came back home, I was like, why don't we do this? And I was like, okay, let's start doing it. Turns out we didn't do it because it was annoying as heck. But props to people who do it. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, that's my tip for today. But also, a huge motivator for these big companies are their customers, and those customers, let's take food packaging, for example. If your grocery store stops carrying produce wrapped in plastic, that's a motivation for those companies to stop wrapping their cucumbers in plastic.
Oh my God, right?
Okay, is it just me? But like every time I see plastic wrapped cucumbers, I just get so angry for some reason.
I get angry, but then I also simultaneously want to look up the YouTube video where you're going to be able to see a bunch of cucumbers getting wrapped in basically a plastic condom. And I imagine it's probably very satisfying and also disturbing at the same time.
They have factories. Guys, they have factories for wrapping cucumbers in plastic.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. So what is something that you can do then? Like, I imagine, I've not done this personally, but maybe what we should do is we should challenge everyone listening and also ourselves to write an email or give a call to our local grocery store and just be like, hey, this is important to me, and I'm going to do my best to try and only purchase produce that doesn't have any plastic on it, including plastic cucumbers. Just so you know, because I think that's something that is often missing, is it's good to have that action of just changing what you buy. And that information is kind of collected, but I think sending a letter, even an email, can be quite effective as well, because then you're directly telling them the reason for your action, as opposed to you just didn't feel like a cucumber that day, Yeah, so I think that's my challenge to myself and everyone else listening.
Yeah, and that's always like, it's always like the first step, right?
Yeah, for sure.
And I saw this other video. The first time I watched it, I kind of felt like, well, they're putting the responsibilities on the consumers when it shouldn't be. But they didn't make a good point. Like, I might try doing this where whenever I'm buying something with plastic packaging, taking a look at the resin code and see if it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So I know if I can throw it in the blue bin or not.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
But this is also very tedious and very time consuming. So
and it's not always available as well.
Exactly.
Because that's the other thing, is we often think because it's available to us, it's available to everybody. And I'm not going to say that that's the case for our listeners. But I think, yeah, there's certain things that we can at least try to do. Engaging with social media petitions when they come across your feed, that's also an entirely viable way to deal with this issue. I think there's so many ways to get involved.
And anytime you can, buy package lists.
For sure.
Packaging, I have a statistics here. So these are stats from ourworldindata.org. Primary plastic production by industrial sector. This is data from 2015. This article was released in 2018. So this is basically what have our plastic been going into? What have we been using our plastic for? Packaging. 146 million tons of plastic in packaging.
Wow.
This is world data. 146 million tons. I can't even wrap my head around this number.
How can I? I don't what? That's so big.
That's plastic, packaging is the leading use for plastic right now, or back in 2015 at least.
And can I just say, it's not I'm trying to think of a single thing that requires the packaging to be made out of plastic specifically.
Electronics, if you buy a laptop, They come with styrofoam.
Okay, protection. So maybe to keep it safe. But even then, you can get cardboard kind of into interesting formations to create a safety barrier.
But that's expensive. But styrofoam is cheap because it's mostly air.
Yeah. That's ridiculous.
So I had to throw this number out because I just was like, what the hell?
Yeah, that's a lot.
Plastic waste by sector. So this is global data. Packaging generates 141 million tons of plastic waste. Textile, so your clothing, generates 42 million tons of plastic waste. Electrical/electronic generates 30 million tons of plastic waste.
And this is world level, eh?
This is world level.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's massive.
It is massive.
I guess, again, it puts it into perspective what an individual is really dealing with when it comes to this, and why it's important to connect in a community and on a city level and on a sector level to try and make change, because you can do as much as you want as a one person, but at the end of the day, we need to get more people moving on this. We need to get corporations moving on this and institutions moving on it. Yeah.
And oh my God, you can edit this into an earlier section of the podcast, but I did forget to mention something that I thought was really interesting. But the color of the plastic that's being recycled has different value. Clear or non-colored plastics are worth more than dyed plastic, especially dyed orange or blues.
So if you have to choose a plastic, choose clear or white.
Yeah, because they're worth more, and it's more recyclable because it's worth more.
It's more likely to actually get recycled.
Exactly. So kind of like, if you think about, recycling is also just another money generating industry at this point, or it's built into this system.
Yeah.
So if the recycling process for this particular plastic material, it costs more than creating new plastic, it's not going to be a very popular choice, even though it is better for our environment.
Interesting. Wow. Okay, well, so all of this to say, like, what are the takeaways here? The takeaways, I guess, are this is way bigger than anyone might have even thought.
I would say your second takeaway that I hope you leave with is, although recycling seems like a myth, 10% of all plastic being recycled is better than 0% plastic being recycled.
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. And also, I guess taking away that concept that there are companies out there that are looking to make a difference. So the 3 companies that we mentioned earlier on in the podcast, with TerraCycle, Full Circle Plastics, and what was
Fusionthetics.
Fusionthetics. I'm not going to remember. I need to remember these. My apologies to you 3 beautiful companies. But companies like that, and I'm sure there's tons around the world, these are just ones in Canada, actually trying to make a difference when it comes to plastic and the recycling thereof. I think that is something to look up to. That is something to be excited about as well. And I think also just the knowledge that it's okay to maybe be a bit gentler to ourselves when it comes to our own individual actions, to recognize 100%. The importance of it, but at the end of the day, let's not villainize improper recycling quite so much.
Yeah, I totally agree. And if recycling isn't part of your habit, try making it. All it takes to start is recycling your office papers.
Sure, exactly. Yeah.
Or your toilet paper rolls.
Yeah, for sure. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for going into this deep dive into recycling, Yuko. It's certainly blown my mind.
It was a whole thing. I spent so many sleepless nights just like, oh God. Oh my God.
I would really love in the future of this podcast to be able to talk to somebody who's in the recycling business. Maybe maybe a person from one of the companies you mentioned or someone else, to get a little bit more insight into the technical aspects of it. I think that would be really interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. Awesome.
All
right.
Well,
yeah, thanks everybody for listening, and we will see you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the EcoThink podcast. We hope you enjoyed learning something with us today. EcoThink podcast is an official product of EcoThink Productions. You can find past episodes, transcripts, and show notes on ecothinkproductions.com/podcast. You can support us by following us on Instagram and Twitter at EcoThink Productions, and join the Patreon on patreon.com/EcoThink. See you next week.